Hello, my name is Matthew Roby and I am a postdoctoral fellow studying medieval Icelandic literature at the University of Iceland. So we're here today on a very windy day, until very recently it was quite a bright day, but a very windy and rainy day on the end of Alptanes Peninsula. This is Alptanes Kirkja, and we're going to start off the segment by talking about one of the most famous Icelandic sagas, that is Egils Saga. And one of the great stories in Egils Saga took place somewhere on Alptanes. So Egils Saga was certainly written no later than the 13th century, and it tells a fictionalized version of the life of an Icelander called Egil Skallagrimsson, who was the son of one of the original settlers in the 10th century. And it was at a farm somewhere nearby on the Alptanes Peninsula that we get the first story from Egil's life. So Egil was the son of one of the original settlers whose name was Skallagrimur, and Skallagrimar's father-in-law, Egil's grandfather, had a farm somewhere on Alptanes, nearby here. And he came to the house of Skallagrimur when Egil was only 3, to invite Skallagrimur and his son Thorolfur to a party somewhere around here at his farm. Egil was a very precocious child, very prodigious. By the age of 3, he was already very talkative, very eloquent, and apparently he was as big as a 6 or 7-year-old, although he was very ugly, like his father. Although Egil wasn't officially invited to this feast by his grandfather Ingvar, he asks Skallagrimur, his father, whether he can come. He's desperate to go to the party. And Skallagrimur tells him, no, you can't come, and utters a very famous line. He says, Egil, you can't come because you can't behave yourself around people when there's a lot of drinking, and you aren't easy to deal with, even when you are not drunk. And so, although this line doesn't specifically assure us that Egil was known as a big drinker by the age of 3, it does certainly imply that his father knows what he's like at feasts where there would be drinking, and perhaps even what he's like when he's drunk. The truth of the matter, of course, is that children wouldn't really have been partaking in heavy drinking at feasts, wouldn't be drinking alcohol. And this characterization of Egil as already able to drink alcohol at the age of 3 is just another part of his precocious nature. So anyway, Skallagrimur says, no, you can't come, and he and Thorolfur and a number of his men then set off on horseback to the farm here on Alptanes. Egil waits for a little while after they've gone, and then, just a 3-year-old boy, he steals one of his father's pack horses, climbs on top of it, and begins the journey to Alptanes on his own. As you may be able to tell, the land around here is quite marshy, and the saga says that Egil struggled to navigate through the marshes on this pack horse on his own, but he kept the party of his father in sight, tried not to be noticed, but kept him in sight so he could navigate his way to his grandfather's farm. And eventually he arrives here on Alptanes. When he gets to the farm, the party has already started. People inside are already drinking, and they're already improvising poetry, which was something that the sagas say the medieval Scandinavians would do at feasts. So Egil arrives, and his grandfather welcomes him, and probably much to his father's chagrin, places him in a seat of honour next to Ingvar. And again, it's not specifically stated that Egil is drinking at the feast, although there is a lot of drinking going on, and it's possible that audiences thought that he was drinking. And then this 3-year-old boy decides that he will also participate in the verse improvising. And so he speaks 2 verses to his grandfather. The first one boasting about his poetic prowess and implying that he should be given a reward, perhaps gold, for his poetry. After which his grandfather rewards him with 3 shells and 1 duck egg. And then Egil speaks another verse thanking his grandfather for those rewards. Now, again, it's probably a little bit implausible that a 3-year-old child was improvising verses, just like it's implausible that a 3-year-old child was navigating the marshes on a horse, or was at a drinking feast. But of course, Egil is one of these child prodigies, and the fact that he improvises these verses is part of a very common trope in the medieval Icelandic sagas to portray children as very precocious, quick to mature, talking early and doing adult activities at an early age. And of course, the literary reason for that is that it foreshadows their future greatness as adults. Now, why would the saga author use improvising poetry to show that Egil was prodigious? Partially, the type of poetry that the medieval Scandinavians told was very complicated, very intricate, and so the fact that he could improvise a verse in that form shows just how eloquent, just how advanced his speech was at the age of 3. And of course, the other thing is, reciting poetry to the lord of a feast, whether this was a king or in this case just Egil's grandfather, was something that adults did in the sagas as a way of showing prowess. And so Egil is practicing something that he will later do at various foreign courts in order to show his success. And in fact, at a much later point in the saga, when Egil is an adult, he even uses poetry to save his own life. He's about to be executed, and he manages to convince the king not to execute him by producing a particularly eloquent poem. And so by doing this at the age of 3, Egil is sort of showing how prodigious he is and foreshadowing what a great hero he will turn out to be. So we've arrived now in the second of our locations for Egils Saga. We're in modern-day Borgarnes, but of course in the Middle Ages there wasn't a town here, and the headland that Borgarnes is on was simply called Digranes. Now, according to the sagas, Egils Saga and other sagas, people during settlement era Iceland would often meet together, people of the region would meet together for games, whether this was ball games or wrestling matches, or even horse fights. And in fact, it was at one such ball game that Egil committed his first act of killing. This was just slightly further up the fjord here, when he was 6 or 7 years old, playing against a much older boy. And obviously he didn't do very well in the game, and he ended up killing the boy with an axe. But right now, we're going to fast forward a bit in time to when Egil is 12, and he attends a ball game here on Digranes with his father, Skallagrímur, and a friend of his, Þórður, who is 20 years old. Now, at this point, Skallagrímur is becoming quite old and frail, but he's still, because of his supernatural strength, one of the strongest men in the district. And so the young Egil and his friend Þórður are pitted against him in a ball game. And the ball game goes like this. While it's still light, and in fact the ball game happened in early winter, so the weather might not have been that different than the blustery and quite cold weather that we're having today. While it was still light, it is said that Skallagrímur was not at his strongest and he was losing the game. Egil and Þórður were winning. But as the sun started to go down, as it became darker, Skallagrímur seemed to grow stronger. But not only stronger, he also grew wilder, almost unable to control his actions. The first thing he does is grab Þórður, Egil's 20-year-old friend, and dashes him down onto the ground and kills him immediately. And after he's done that, he then turns and seizes his own son, Egil. Now, Egil had a foster mother who looked after him when he was growing up, and her name was Þorgerðar Brák. And she was said to be practiced in magic. And she was also at this ball game. And at this point, once Skallagrímur has grabbed her foster son Egil, she steps in and rescues him. She shouts at Skallagrímur and she says, Hamask þú nú, Skallagrímur, at syni þínum, which means, Skallagrímur, you are now going crazy against your own son. So at that point, Skallagrímur drops Egil on the ground and begins to chase after Þorgerðr. And apparently she runs the length of the headland here over to the edge, and then with nowhere further to run, she jumps into the sea. And at that point, Skallagrímur, calling upon his supernatural strength, picks up a huge boulder and throws it after her. It hits her between the shoulders, and the saga says neither her nor the boulder were seen again. Egil is very upset about this. He seems to have loved his foster mother very much. I mean, she looked after him when he was young. And so that night, when they are having dinner at Borg, Egil is late to come to the table. And when he does come in, he walks over to Skallagrímur's favourite servant and strikes him once in the head, killing him immediately. And then Egil sits down, the body presumably still lying at the table, and begins to eat his food. And having each killed one another's favourite servant, neither of them speak to each other for the whole winter. This term hamask, which Þorgerðr shouts at Skallagrímur, does not just mean you're going crazy now, Skallagrímur. It relates to the concept of shape-shifting, and in fact it's related to a number of terms that use the same root word, hamr, which means shape. People who are shapeshifters can be described as hamramr, meaning shape strong, or as being eigi einhamr, which means not always being in one shape. Now this shape-shifting, this can refer in other texts in Old Norse literature to genuine shape-shifting where people will take on the form of animals. That's usually in the mythic or legendary sources. And it's also a term that is associated with the figure of the berserker, who goes into a berserker rage, which is sometimes described using these shape-shifting terms. So what's the nature of shape-shifting in this saga? Well, it seems to be hereditary, because Skallagrímur's own father was a shapeshifter too. He's described as being hamramr, and it's described that when the sun starts to go down, he becomes angry. People are unwilling to talk to him at that point. And in fact, this is why he gets his name Kveldulfur, which means evening wolf. And we see the same kind of symptoms in Skallagrímur's shapeshifting. It seems to happen when it's turning night, and he gets this supernatural strength, but also a lack of control. And what might it reveal that he does this? I mean, on the one hand, it could reveal that either pre- or post-Christianization Icelanders believed in shape-shifting, and that's why they put it in their story. It could suggest a sort of a point of nationalistic pride, that the Icelanders believed that there was something supernatural and magical about their ancestors, about the first settlers. And another interesting thing, of course, is that it could be being used as a literary symbol. Shape-shifting being used as a symbol for something that people actually might experience in real life. So Skallagrímur's shape-shifting is like a rage, a fit of rage. It might be being used as a literary symbol for anyone with a bad temper, or perhaps even a pathology, like an anger management issue, a personality disorder, or something like that. And the other important thing about this episode is the relationship between Egil and Þorgerðr Brauk. He obviously loves his foster mother very much, and this is actually quite a common figure in the sagas. Many heroes have female foster mothers. Sometimes they're old, sometimes they're poor, often they're magical, and they are very beneficial to the hero. Now, those figures, they embody a number of demographics that we might think of as usually being marginalized for their gender, for their old age, or for their poverty. After all, Þorgerðr Brauk is a slave, and yet the sagas are able to use these magical foster mothers who help the heroes out as a way to portray those marginalized demographics in a more positive light. This, it turns out, is actually a monument that is dedicated to Þorgerðr Brauk, and it shows how much the town of Borgarnes likes her as a figure. Similarly to Egil, she is a very positive figure. She saves his life, and she allows him to go on living to become the great hero that he does. Just before we leave Borgarnes, we just wanted to point out another few things that are here. This is a local park called Skallagrímsgarður, named after Skallagrímur, Egil's father. This is supposedly the mound in which Skallagrímur and Egil's son Böðvar were buried. And we'll be talking more about them when we get to Borg, which was the farm where both Skallagrímur and Egil lived. So now we've reached our final stop in Egils Saga. This is Borg á Mýrum, which is the site of the farm that Skallagrímur founded when he first arrived in Iceland, and the farm where Egil lived after him. Both of them lived here actually to their old age and their eventual death. When Skallagrímur died, Egil took his body, as you know, as we just mentioned when we were in Borgarnes, over to Digranes, which is just over there, and put him in that mound that we saw. Now, when Egil himself was growing old, a couple of tragedies befell him. First of all, his son Gunnar died, and then in another tragic accident in a storm on Borgafjörður, tragically his son Böðvar was drowned. And when this happened, Egil heard about it and immediately rowed to the shore to find his son's drowned body, picked up the corpse and put it on his knees and rowed over to Skallagrímur's mound and placed his son Böðvar next to his father in the mound, as the carving that we looked at in Borgarnes showed. Now this was a huge blow to Egil, and once he had put his son in the mound, he then returned here to Borg, his farmstead, returned to his bed, locked himself in his bed closet and waited there without taking any food or drink for several days. Now Egil's actions obviously trouble the other residents at Borg, and so they call for his daughter to come and try and help Egil out of his grief. She manages to convince him to let her into the bed closet where he's lying, and she manages to trick him into drinking a little bit of milk, which, you know, because he was depressed and almost trying to starve himself to death, might have saved his life. She then convinces him to write a poem about Böðvar and the passing of his sons as a method of trying to process his grief. As you know, from a young age, Egil was an accomplished poet, and it was through writing this poem that his daughter convinced him to write that he managed to overcome his grief. He wrote a very long poem which was called Sonatorrek, which is usually translated as On the Irreparable Loss of Sons. And it was through the process of writing it that he managed to overcome his depression, and once he'd finished composing it, he was able to continue with his life, and he lived here at Borg to a ripe old age. Now this monument over here is called Sonatorrek, and it is inspired by the poem that Egil wrote to overcome his grief. Now what's significant about this? Well, I think the very idea that the medieval author of the saga would have Egil, who is, you know, quite a strong, violent character, also show such deep emotion through this poem is very significant, and it certainly contradicts the popular notion of the Vikings as, you know, unthinking or violent brutes. But it's also a strikingly modern notion that somebody who was experiencing depression and grief would be able to process it and eventually overcome it by sharing and expressing their emotions through art or through poetry, which Egil does through his poem Sonatorrek. Harsh was the rift that the wave hewed in the wall of my father's kin. I know it stands unfilled and open, my son's breach that the sea wrought. The sea goddess has ruffled me, stripped me bare of my loved ones. The ocean severed my family's bonds, the tight knot that tied me down. If by sword I might avenge that deed, the brewer of waves would meet his end, smite the wind's brother that dashes the bay, do battle against the sea god's wife. Yet I felt I lacked the might to seek justice against the killer of ships, for it is clear to all eyes how an old man lacks helpers. Now my course is tough. Death close sister of Odin's enemy, stands on the ness, with resolution and without remorse. I shall gladly await my own. So that's it for our segment on Egils Saga. If you liked it, remember, you can like and subscribe, and watch out for more videos from this series on stories from the sagas. Thank you and goodbye.